Welcome to A Parent's Guide to Child Development. I'm your host, Anna-Marie Von Furley from Fledglings Flight. Each podcast, we strive to give parents the tools they need to help their child thrive through conversations with experts in child development and psychology, where you can learn about the most important information that you didn't know existed. Have you ever wondered why your child can hear you perfectly fine, yet still seems to miss what you're saying? Or why some kids breeze through learning to read while others struggle to connect sounds to letters? The answer often lies in something most of us have never heard of: auditory processing. And it turns out the way our children's brains process what they hear shapes everything from their first words to their ability to thrive in a classroom. Today's guest has spent more than 3 decades unraveling this very mystery. Lois Kam Heymann is a speech-language pathologist and one of the leading authorities on auditory processing disorder. She's worked with countless children facing listening, hearing, and learning challenges, and has guided just as many parents through the journey of understanding what their child truly needs. Lois, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, my pleasure. To start us off, can you explain in simple terms what auditory processing is and how it differs from hearing?
Sure. So that's the question I get all the time. And so when we are born, and if we pass our universal screening in the hospital, it means that our ears are hearing. That means that sound is coming in and it's being mechanically sent through our ears. And so that is hearing. And then when the sound reaches the eighth cranial nerve, getting a little technical, but then it starts its listening journey. And the journey goes from the right ear to the left brain and left ear to the right brain. And then the sound has to cross over to share that with both sides of the brain. And that journey of the sound to the brain, where it's getting processed in lots of different ways, and it happens like this, that is auditory processing. So hearing comes first, the availability of the sounds, and then listening comes next, and that's how we develop oral language.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Why is auditory processing such a critical foundation for language development in young children?
Well, another great question. So when the sound comes up, right, through the pathways and it gets shared with the brain is processing in the right side of the brain, basically, the sounds, ah, buh, duh, all the sounds of speech, and the rhythm and the prosody of the way that our language moves. When it's shared to the right, to the left side of the brain, that's where we process it as language, right? And so as the sound comes up, I'll give you a little demonstration, okay? So let's take the word cat. So in order for the child to start hearing and then saying and recognizing the word cat, first, they are hearing all the sounds of speech. And all of a sudden, in about 9 months, those sounds, when they're in a certain sequence, k, ah, t, k, ah, t, start sounding like cat. And every time they hear that, somebody is pointing to a cat in a book or pointing to the animal running around. And then they start recognizing, oh, that and this is the same. That's cat. And we store it in our brain. And then as we start talking about the cat, oh, it's soft and it's fluffy and it has a long tail and has paws and claws, we start grouping all that necessary information for us to really understand catness, right? The concept of cat. So those early stimulation of the pathways, and the only way the pathways grow is by stimulation. Hearing is there, but if we're not stimulating those pathways, they don't develop. And so, and that's the way we get language to the brain.
Wow. Huh.
It's
That was
fascinating.
really fascinating how you explained that. Yeah. I think you already answered this, but there's a second part to this question that I think that parents would love to know. So you'd mentioned around 9 months of age, auditory processing, where they start associating sounds with a word that is a concept like a cat. And what milestones should parents be aware of in the early years, starting from when they first process and then moving on from there?
Right. Well, it's a little, I'm going to take you back a little bit. It's what
Yeah.
we're feeding in. So we go down as sort of a hierarchy. So first you have to detect a sound. So when the child turns their head towards a sound, right?
Mhm.
That's detection. That's the first step. That usually happens around the second and third month of life. Then they start hearing that and locating where that sound's coming from. And they start hearing the differences between bottle, let's say, here's your bottle, and moo for a cow, right? And they start, and that's called discrimination. So once they start and you say bottle, let's go get your bottle, about 6 months of age, they might start looking toward the refrigerator, right?
Yeah.
Or
Mhm.
so they start letting you know, I heard that and I understand what's coming. They've attached that. And then and that's discrimination. And then they go to identification and you say, moo, and they point to the cow or they give you the cow, right? And that's understanding and receptive language is beginning. So we have to get all this receptive information, the information coming in, before anything's going to come out that is speech and language. And so after 6 months, now we start playing with things. And I say, oh, where's the cow? And I say moo, and the child tries to imitate moo, right? And they're letting us know I hear it. I understand what you're saying, and I'm going to try to do that. And of course, this is developed through reciprocation, where the adult and the child are having a conversation, even if it just sounds like babble back and forth, right?
Mhm.
But that's that beginning of that, so that they're learning from us and they're identifying, and then comprehension comes. Oh, that's the cow, and I'm putting it in this building that looks like a farm with the sheep, the dog, and the goat. And now all of a sudden, a category starts emerging of understanding. And then they say moo, and then later you change it to cow. So
Mhm.
all of that auditory input in the first year of life, it's what leads to the amount of vocabulary and the amount of words available to that child.
Hmm. Yeah, it made me think of like when you're learning a second language, how you always understand more than you can say. So it sounds like that process is deeply embedded in the way the human brain works and in the language centers in the brain.
Right. And this is a whole neurological process that's happening. And, to go back to your first question, when that process is disturbed in the pathways, so they hear cow, but they only hear ow
Mhm.
because it didn't get processed, then they're not getting the right information. And that's what causes problems with being able to discriminate sounds when you have to learn to read. Like this whole first year is the setup, right, of the auditory system to learn language and understand language and then use language appropriately.
So what are some of the early signs that a child may be struggling with auditory processing rather than simply being inattentive or stubborn?
Right. So, in the first year of life, we really don't have inattentive or stubborn. If we are, but kids that aren't being played with and stimulated auditorily, for instance, they're given the phone instead of, to scroll through, instead of having a conversation with somebody, or, and through play is the way. And so we start seeing a child that isn't attentive to sound, but that's because we're not developing that, right? So the two go hand in hand. But when the child doesn't look for the auditory information, you turn on music and they just sit there and they're not looking to see where it's coming from. Those are our first signs. Or you say, oh, where's your bottle? And all of a sudden they're not looking or associating that. So that might be the message isn't coming up clearly.
Yeah.
And so that could be eventually an auditory processing disorder. But when we get to year one, and the child should start following one-step directions. Oh, where are your shoes? Let's get your shoes. Then if they're not doing that kind of follow through, then we might start suspecting that this might be an auditory language processing difficulty. And then as we go through, by 2 years old, we want them following two-step directions. Go get your shoes and your coat.
Mm.
That's two pieces. So we start seeing children not reaching their language milestones, and we start saying, is that language processing, or does it go back to auditory to language?
Hmm. So, is this at all correlated with calling your child's name and them not responding?
Yes. So thank you for that. Yes. So in the beginning, their head whips around when you say anything, right? But when you say their name, which is much later, right? It's about, 6 to 9 months, we start them recognizing their name. That's discrimination, right? That's being able to hear the difference between Lois and Anna Marie,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. And so if, I'm not going to turn when I hear Anna Marie, but I'll turn when I hear Lois, I have to
Mhm.
hear the differences between those two words and know that Lois is me. And again, that comes through play of
Mhm.
identifying that. If a child's not doing that, then that's another sign. Wow, something isn't going quite right. Let's go check this out.
Yeah, and I think not for the littlest babies, but I think for older children, I think the assumption with parents is that they're ignoring me or they're choosing to not acknowledge that I'm saying something to them, which is, I think, why I chose that word stubbornness. So, the choosing to ignore, but what it could be is that it's an auditory processing issue.
Right. And we can call it an auditory processing struggle because we really
Struggle.
don't know, right? Just because there's challenges, there's struggles, and then there's disorder. And we can't really diagnose, and the audiologist is the one that diagnoses the auditory processing disorder. And
Mhm.
that can happen until 5 to 7.
Oh,
So the person to go to for early intervention to figure out what it might be would be a speech language pathologist.
oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
so let's go back just for a second because
Yeah.
that stubbornness or behavior, it's
Mhm.
that behavior is not I'm not doing it or I don't want to do it. It's
Mhm.
usually I can't do it.
Huh.
And so, the kids in the first year of life, they're not digging their heels in and not paying attention to you. They
Yeah.
want to pay attention to you.
Mhm.
They want that interaction. They want that stimulation from you. And so that's what they need. I call it the auditory diet, right? Is what we feed in. So, we also have to look at our behavior as the adult. Am I engaging my child enough in play, in language, in music, in dancing to the music? There are so many things that we can do in that first year of life, and it all involves play,
Hmm.
you know?
How does auditory processing disorder or APD typically present in toddlers versus school-age children?
Well, school-age children, we usually will see kids having difficulty learning the set sounds of the letters.
Huh.
So we start identifying a reading issue. But when we look deeper at a reading issue, it really may be, and usually is, a phonological issue. Phonological meaning I'm not hearing the difference between the sounds, so I can't identify the difference, especially if two sounds are very close. Like I don't want to use but and duh. But auditorily, sh and ch are very, very close. So, but when a child can't hear the difference between those, that's going to hold up their reading, right? That's going to be a signal, something's going on here. In toddlers, it's more of looking for the sound, following the direction, gaining words. How many words does your child know, understand? And then how many words do they start saying? And what they know is much bigger, like you said before, than what they say. But the interesting thing is that we actually know how many words a child needs to hear and different words during the first and second year of life and third year of life in order to have the right number of words that I understand and concepts I understand before I go to kindergarten.
Hmm.
And
And
that
what is
number will
it?
astound you. That it will astound you, right? So the number is, and this comes from research that was done, and there's a book called 80,000 words and 80 million words, and it's just all about developing vocabulary. And what they found is that it's 21,000 words a day.
Wow.
Now, but let's think about this. It's really interesting because it's the difference between a parent saying, and it doesn't mean a parent should be talking all day long. Absolutely not. That would be, causing a lot of
Yeah.
too much stimulation. But it's the difference between saying to your toddler, let's get dressed, get dressed, get dressed, get dressed, get dressed. Two words, even though I've said them three times. And the difference between, wow, it's time to get dressed and it's cold outside today. So do you want to wear your long pants? Or you could wear the green ones or the blue ones. And the child points to blue. You say, okay, you want to wear your blue ones. And then let's, get a t-shirt. And then you must wear a sweater because it is, or a sweatshirt. It's really cold. Now, that is a bath of language that the child starts connecting to the actions and what they're putting on their body. And
Mm.
that is, I just gave you 10 to 12 to 15 words. So it's really narrating what's going on, speaking to your child as you're doing things without expecting a verbal response.
Yeah, I love that phrase, bath of language. It's very visceral.
And
It's
it's
really
true. It's just we talk to our and I have a new grandchild, and I've
Mhm.
been, with him and demonstrating for my son and my daughter-in-law about just, and the other day she was changing the baby and she goes, I'm going to change your diaper now. Okay, you're very wet. And I was like, how
Yay.
awesome. Yay. And that's, what we need to do. But a lot of parents have difficulty with this,
Mhm.
have difficulty first, and some cultures also don't believe in speaking to your child like that until they speak back to you. And, I've developed listening and language programs for young children all over the world. And, you meet cultures where, oh, we don't do that kind of thing. And then also parents in our country here speaking English are wary of speaking to the child. And of course, we're very busy, right? We're very busy and we're very busy on screens. So there's a lot that gets in the way of us doing this. And I created this program, Do Say Play, which is just a guide for parents. How do I start? And how do I, just take this toy? Um, how do I take this toy and play with it and bathe my child in language?
Mhm.
And that's it's like a starter. Like, oh, you can do this. We all can do this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Many parents confuse APD with hearing loss or ADHD. Can you walk
Right.
us through how these conditions overlap and where they differ?
Okay, so hearing loss we talked about, it happens in the ear, right? So inside the inner ear, we have hair cells, and those hair cells are set up, it's in the cochlea, and they're set up like the piano scale. And if any of those hair cells are broken or flattened, then you're going to have a hearing loss.
Huh.
And that hearing loss means that those sounds don't go through. So that's where, if you're developing oral language, then that's where you would go for hearing aids or cochlear implants, which would then stimulate that and get those sounds to the brain. So that's hearing loss. Let's take ADHD or ADD, and that is attention deficit. So attention deficit and auditory attention look alike, but we have to pull that apart. So the very simple way I explain that is if a child is inattentive, no matter what the stimulation is, whether it's visual, whether it's auditory, whether it's, whatever input is being, and the child can't focus on it, can't stay with it, then and they're very distractible by what is going on in their environment. That's probably going to lead us down the attention deficit path. But
Okay.
if the child, when they're doing something visual, they're doing something and they're engaged in something that is using their body or their vision rather than their auditory, but the minute the auditory starts being important, they can't focus on that. That's the way we sort of separate it. But auditory has a lot built into it, so we
Mhm.
have to look at it very carefully. And that's why, if you're concerned about that, you should, I believe that attention deficit disorder is labeled erroneously very often, and that we have to look at the auditory processing, which people are starting to do now. They're starting to recognize that it may not be. And, there's no pill for auditory processing. There's no medication for that. It's doing the work of rebuilding those listening pathways. And we can do
Mhm.
that because of neuroplasticity. So there are three very different things, but they end up looking very similar.
Right. Yeah.
So,
So how does, I think you talked a little bit about this, how does background noise, like a busy classroom or a noisy household, impact a child with auditory processing challenges?
right. So, one area of auditory processing, and it's just one area, is listening in noise or signal to noise ratio. So, that's where a child, so with the way our ears work is so fascinating. It's that our right ear is supposed to be listening for the signal, which is the voice. And the left ear is supposed to be pushing those background noises away. Right? But if our processing is not set up that way, the work is not happening. This ear is not pushing those sounds away. And so it's masking the speech of the teacher or the parent. And that means that anything in the background is just as important to that child's ears as the voice. And so once we find that out, of course, we're going to lessen the background noise. So in schools, we have lots of accommodations and modifications we can make for the classroom. One of them is an FM device where the teacher wears a little microphone, the child wears a little earpiece, and it brings the teacher's voice closer to the child, even though it's noisy and distracting. In the household, we might not be doing a lot of verbal work with our child, play it when there's a lot of noise in the background. But there's also intervention for that. So once we find that out, that that is actually a problem for the child, and that's the audiologist that would test for that, then we know, okay, this is something we need to work on. And then we can set up intervention to help that child's brain do the work.
That's so interesting. Literally yesterday, I was talking to my husband who was holding his phone like this to his right ear. I'm like, why do you do that? Why don't you just do this? And he said, it was because I'm left-handed. I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? But you just said that the right ear is the one that's hearing words or looking for, so he needs to hold it to his right ear instead of his left ear because you think you're left and like I hold the phone like this and I'm right-handed. So he's like, oh well, I have to do this because I'm left-handed. And I'm like, why? Why wouldn't you just do this?
No, and
But
what he's really saying is my right ear is my dominant ear, and I hear better from I'm able, where, you know, dominance has a lot to do with handedness. I mean, it can get very, we could go down a rabbit hole here, but we have a dominant ear, we have a less dominant ear. So we're going to see people with right-handed, but then they're using their right ear, they're using that motorically, or they're using it because that's the ear they hear better at. You know, people that have to have the speaker on because they need to use both ears at the same time.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
And that doesn't mean there's a problem, right? That's not a problem. That's not an indicator of problem. It's just the way we understand our system and how it works best.
Huh. That's really interesting. What role does early identification play in shaping long-term language and academic outcomes?
Well, that's the $1 million question. That's
Right?
right. That is the name of the game, early intervention. You know, when we notice that something is not following the milestones, and unfortunately, pediatricians, parents usually know way before anybody else.
Mm.
They know. And what happens is very often they go to the pediatrician, and pediatrician are wellness people, right? They're not looking for problems, you know, unless you come in with a problem. And so their advice is usually wait.
Yeah.
And that is actually not the right advice. I'm sorry, pediatricians, they're great at what they do. But when we start noticing something, that the earlier you work on auditory skills and language skills, and what you do in if you need intervention, and how you work, the child works with the interventionist, but also how the parent learns from the interventionist, we start not seeing the problems that would have happened in the long run.
Mm.
And so it's really, and I think parents get very afraid, right? They get afraid, oh my goodness, my child's not keeping up. What's this going to mean? I think parents also, because I've worked with parents for, you know, over 40 years, parents then feel like, did I do something wrong? Is this my fault? And we get into that rather than, oh no, here's something that's not developing exactly the way we would like it to. So let's find somebody that can help us do that, right? And to me, but we go through a lot of shame, we go through a lot of blame, and it holds back the ability to say, no, I want my child to read on time. So if I can build those skills now, I'm all for it, right? And that's why, you know, early intervention, if you're seeing a problem, but working with your child and playing with, I don't mean working, playing with your child, that's going to build the skills. And so we avoid all of those unless there's a real disorder, right?
Mhm.
And we're seeing kids with multiple diagnoses now, right? So, oh, they have ADHD, they're on the spectrum, they have ASD. APD comes later, auditory processing. Somebody says, oh, they have auditory processing disorder, but actually the only one that can diagnose that is an audiologist, not the psychologist, not your next door neighbor, not, you know, the teacher. So they can say it looks like they're having trouble processing. So it gets very confusing for parents, I think, and finding somebody they trust, somebody that wants to work with them, somebody that listens to the parent and doesn't feel the professional knows that child better than the parent knows the child. Um,
Mhm.
and having a partnership, that's the magic sauce
Mhm.
for a parent.
What are everyday activities at home that parents can do to strengthen their child's listening and auditory skills?
So we already named one is
Mhm.
that auditory bath of really talking to your child. Um, and that starts when the baby is here and the baby goes, "Abba, baba." And
Mhm.
we can either choose to ignore it or we can look at our child and say, "Abba, baba." And you've started setting up a conversation. And if the child doesn't learn that reciprocalness, that's what we see in middle school
Mm.
sometimes as social difficulties
Yeah.
and turn taking and having a conversation.
Mhm.
But is it that? Or is it they never learned how to do this reciprocal model early on.
Huh.
So talking to your baby and reacting to your baby, and then the play that we talked about, and then the everyday narration, the child being there, when my children were little and I'd be cooking, I'd set them up at the kitchen table, painting or coloring or doing something. And as they were doing that activity, I was there, but I was also talking about I'm cooking. Oh, I'm going to make pasta tonight. And oh, I only have the long spaghetti. I don't have those curly ones you like. So I'm going to make the long spaghetti. And let's see, do we want butter and Parmesan cheese or do we want um, red sauce? And it becomes like part of our interaction and part of our life rather than I have to sit down with my child and teach them how to talk because we
Right.
don't have to do that.
Hmm.
This is not you're not the teacher, right? You're the parent and offering them just like you offer them it's time to they place to walk, right? That you're not constraining them, you're allowing them to move around the house that's giving them the opportunity to walk.
Hmm.
Let's give them the opportunity to listen and talk.
Yeah. How important is reading aloud to children and what techniques make it most effective for auditory development?
Great question. So, reading is play and reading, singing and rhyming.
Huh.
Those are your sort of little steps, and that we should be doing all of them. So, and we don't do nursery rhymes with kids anymore. And I'm telling you that part of reading is rhyming, and nursery rhymes just do that so naturally that the child starts hearing the rhyme. But so reading to your child is very, very important. And actually, people say, when do I start reading to my child? And I say, when they're infants, right? And, what books would I read to my child? And, actually, reading is talking, right? But what you're also doing and what kicks in at about 3 months and 6 months is you're also pointing to the pictures. So you're helping them associate the word to the visual. And that's that connection that then's going to say, oh, that's a cat, right? And how is it different from a dog? And this one says meow, and this one says woof, woof. But also, they're hearing connected language and they're hearing richer vocabulary than you're probably using. And then the
Hmm.
melody and the rate and the pausing is what's important when we read to young children. So giving them time to process, not just reading the book straight through. And actually, in the beginning, we don't even read the words. We just talk about what we see. And then you
Hmm.
start reading the words, and then the child asks for the book over and over again. And that's a great thing because what they're trying to say is, this is familiar to me. I like this. And I'm learning each time you're reading it to me, I'm learning something different or you're reinforcing something. So reading to a child, and in the beginning, it's all about holding the child on your lap or next to you, right? And looking at the book together and reading and pointing and pausing. And that pause, the child will usually fill in with something. And you say, oh, there was the cow. And they might say, cow. And you say, yes, there was a cow. And the cow was running after the gingerbread man. There he goes, run, run, run as fast as you can. And that little chant and rhyme is intonation and melody for our speech production. It all fits together, right?
Yeah. And it's important that it's a human doing that, right? Not relying on like Lamar Burton to read a book on TV or an app that's going to, the child touches a cow and it says cow on in the app or whatever. It needs a human being is where the language comes from.
100%. This can't be replaced by technology. I really don't believe parenting is going to be replaced by technology. And we need that human interaction. And we have to think about our children's sensory system. They're
Hmm.
learning not just through their auditory channel, but the smell of things, when
Hmm.
they put it in their mouth, the taste of things, the movement of things, all of that works together. So when you're reading and they're sitting close to you and they're feeling warm and cuddly, they're not tense, they're relaxed. Reading to a child is and singing with a child are the two ones that bring down our tension, right?
Hmm.
And we um that self can not control, but being able to
Regulation.
say it again. I'm sorry.
Self-regulation.
Self-regulation. Thank you. I was missing that. That's where that comes from. And like we're all dealing with being dysregulated, right? And so many children are dysregulated. But what are we offering children to teach their body how to regulate? And reading and sitting with a child on your lap or next to you is amazing for that. All of
Hmm.
those things kick in. And that's what makes reading pleasurable so that a child eventually wants to learn to read, right?
Hmm.
But my advice to parents is read harder books, even when your child is reading, they're reading, Mercy Watson, and you could then be reading Charlotte's Web, right? It's really, you always want to be feeding in auditorily higher than what they're doing themselves.
Hmm.
So I believe reading to older children. The program that I have at Park Century School, where I'm a consultant, is all about reading to fourth graders, fifth graders, but we read in a certain way. And it's because we need to build those listening skills and language skills. And
Yeah.
so even when they're in third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, and they can read themselves. So that's the magic, is the reading, the playing, the nursery rhymes, the little songs with movements, and not somebody, back in my children's day, it was Barney. Barney was doing it, and the kids all learned the song, right? But it wasn't that attachment to human interaction.
Yeah. And his mouth didn't move.
And Miss Rachel is very popular and she's a speech pathologist and she does great work. And what she's offering is really valuable, but it's not a replacement
Yeah.
for the adult in the child's life.
Hmm. I agree.
That's, yeah.
When a parent suspects their child may have an auditory processing issue, what should their first step be?
Well, if they're wondering about it and the child is very young, then that would be going to a speech language pathologist, finding somebody who does understand and works not just from language comprehension, which
Mm.
is up here in our hierarchy, but actually about listening and language development. And that would be my first step. They will then send the parent, if the child's old enough, to diagnose if it is an auditory processing disorder, and that's through an audiologist that does that kind of testing. When they test for auditory processing disorder, the first thing the audiologist does is give a hearing test to make sure it's not a middle ear infection that's stopping.
Mm.
And for ear infections, early ear infections are when you see a child, all of a sudden they were able to do a skill and now they can't do something. And we say, oh, now that can be diagnosed by the pediatrician, right? An ear infection. But if we have recurrent ear infections, then that's going to also be difficult. So we have to work with the pediatrician about that, but maybe a speech language pathologist to feed in the good sounds after that's remediated. Um, so for me, the first stop is the speech language pathologist that has knowledge in this, but we will then send to the audiologist to make the diagnosis. Is it an auditory processing disorder or is it a listening challenge? Or are we really looking at attention instead of audition?
Hmm.
And that audiologist tests their hearing first, gets that out of the way, and then will then test which is called a CAP test, central auditory processing disorder. And that's finding an audiologist that does that specific testing.
Hmm. What types of therapies and interventions do you find most effective in your 3 decades of practice?
Well, so this is controversial.
Oh.
And I'm going to, yes, because when children are diagnosed with an auditory processing disorder, very often the audiologist will give them an auditory program to work on and an app. And what the app does is, let's say the child is not hearing the difference between pitch, high sounds and low sounds. So there's an app for that. And they can listen to that app. But for me, that is just this tiny little step. The real work is, how is that lack of auditory processing affecting the language or the behavior or the comprehension or reading, right? What is actually, how is it affecting that? And to me, you then work, the intervention should be the bottom up skills. I hear that. I hear the difference between the F sound and the S sound, which are very close, but also then words and language. So when I get a child that has had an auditory processing disorder and they're 12 years old being diagnosed, and then we do a language evaluation and we see that that auditory processing disorder got in the way of building vocabulary, understanding comprehension. That's the work we have to do with that child to really make a difference in what we see in school and socially for that child. It
Mhm.
can't just be that app or that. And again, and they need that personal interaction because communication is personal.
Right.
We're not communicating with apps, and maybe someday we are, but right now, and all the 21st century jobs that our children now are being prepared for are going to need good communication skills.
Hmm.
You see it in all the research that's being done. Yes, they're going to be on apps maybe more, or they're going to be on technology, but those interaction skills, those verbal listening interaction skills are really going to be necessary. And we have to be, communication is the name of the game as far as I'm concerned. And communication happens between people.
Right. How can parents work collaboratively with teachers and schools to support a child with auditory processing challenges?
Well, that's really interesting because parents usually understand this disorder before the teachers do,
Mhm.
right? And for the teachers, very often it's they're not listening, they're not paying attention, and that's what they're seeing and what they're saying. And then educating teachers about, actually, my child has an auditory processing disorder, or my child is having difficulty with their listening skills. And I actually wrote a book about that for parents of young children. It's called The Sound of Hope. And it really, it's available on Amazon, but it breaks it down. What is auditory processing disorder? And before diagnosis, things that a parent can do to build the auditory skills, but how to read to a child, how to rhyme, but also how to go to the teacher and explain what it is,
Mhm.
right? Because very often it is the parent having to carry the message of what's really going on. So, we are our children's best advocates, but then working together of what can the teacher do in the school, right? In the classroom, move the child to the front of the room, make sure that the child's not sitting next to the fish tank, making sure that the fan or the air conditioning sound isn't distracting for where the child's sitting, not having a classroom where in rows, but it's better to be in a U so that the child can see the other children and hear them answering. We can do so many accommodations in the classroom, and also so that it's not like we're having to do something special for our child, but what's the better accommodation that all the children are going to be um, gaining something from. And then being able to attach the teacher with the speech and language pathologist, if that's who's working with the child, so that they can, the therapist can give really good help to the teacher. But it has to be a team and it has to be a partnership. It can't be, very often our anxiety of we have to get this done, we need to do this now, and then it becomes an argument and a fight. Um, Going to meetings at your child's school, very often, if you are working with an advocate or a speech language pathologist, bring them, right? The school's going to listen to them over the parent, unfortunately, right? So I think there's, things we can do to help schools understand our child in particular.
I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it bears repeating. How do screens, tablets, and constant background media affect children's developing auditory systems?
So again, if we're interfering with that message, right, going from the ear to the brain, then that's where there's a lot of noise or a lot of difficulty. I'll give you a little example from my book that I use. I wrote the book with Rosie O'Donnell because 20 years ago, I was her child's therapist and he had auditory processing disorder. He's now married and has a baby and, it's lovely. But she wanted to get the word out about this. And one of the things we had to change for Blake was where he sat in the car and where, because of which ear was stronger for him and where he was receiving. And she used to play loud music all the time. She had 4 kids at the time, and it was an open plan room. And Blake would leave the family and go to his room because it was quiet. Or when they would go out to a restaurant, when they went to sports bar type of places, not a bar, but those kind of pub restaurants, and there was lots of noise in the background, he would cry and want to leave. And it because sensory wise, it was too much for him. And that's not the child's fault. We have to accommodate. So that's one thing. Should we be playing music in the house? Yes. Should we be singing and dancing? Yes, but not constantly. Even, these noise machines that parents are using with young children, the white noise, we're finding that it's too loud very often, and it's damaging the child's hearing. So we have to be very careful about what is in our environment that's going to get in the way of that sound getting to the child's brain. So that's, if we're going to do homework with a child, with an older child, we're not going to do it while the dishwasher's in the kitchen while the dishwasher's running. That wouldn't be a good thing for us to be doing. So it's really thinking about the distractions that would get in the way and trying to minimize those while we're doing anything that requires understanding or language. I hope I answered your question. Did I hit all the areas?
Yes.
Okay.
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 Are there myths or misconceptions about language development and listening that you wish every parent knew the truth about?
Yes. That listening has to develop in order for language to develop and then speech to develop. So actual talking. And here's the thing, when you look at the skills a child needs to go to school, right? Listening and language and speaking is supposed to happen at home.
Hmm.
We're supposed to send our kids to school with those with those skills so that they can understand the teaching that the teacher is teaching and they can learn to read and write, which is supposed to happen at school. And these are all language-based things. Reading and writing are language-based. So, but when the child is on screens, when the child is not being talked to, when the child is not developing those listening and language skills, and they go to school with under the amount that they need to understand the teaching, they're going to fall behind. And once you're behind in language in school, it moves so quickly that it's very hard to catch up. So I believe the myth, the misconception is that children are getting what they need from screens, and that this couldn't be further from the truth, and that when a child isn't getting that rich auditory environment that leads to language environment, you're not setting your child up for success in school, because the expectation in school is that the child is coming to school with a certain amount of words. So I always, in my lectures, I always talk about what's the number of words a child has to understand in order to be successful socially and academically in kindergarten. And there is no right answer, right? Some children go with 3,000 words, understanding. Some kids go with 5,000 words. Some kids go with 10,000 words. Some kids go with 30,000 words. Which child is going to be more successful in kindergarten? It's as simple as that.
Wow. Well, I could talk to you about this all day,
Me too.
but we're almost approaching an hour, which is fantastic. And this has been so fascinating. How can parents get a hold of you?
So that's great. Thank you. My website is listenlovelearn.com. And on that website, they will be led to Lois, Lois, at listenlovelearn.com if they want to communicate with me. I do offer, I'm no longer doing individual therapy for individual children, but I do a consultation, a multi-step consultation if parents are concerned or want to touch base and see, is my child developing well? Or if they're seeing a problem or have reports and they need some help in figuring out what their steps are. So I do a consultation like that, either on Zoom or here in Los Angeles in person. I'm here in Los Angeles with you. Um, and um, and then there's my programs that are on the website for playing with your child, understanding, listening, all of those things. But getting in touch with me that way, they can also follow for tips on Instagram, and it's listen_love_learn. But I'm available. They write me an email, and I am ready to talk to them because this is my mission right now. I've had a long career and working with children, but it's really getting this information out and helping parents help their children.
Yay. And you have a couple books too. Tell us about those.
So I have the one book, so that's the Sound of Hope on Amazon, and that's all about early intervention. It's all about before the age of 8. What are we looking at and how can we play with our child? What should we read? I give reading lists. I give ways to read, all the questions you asked me. And then the pamphlets that I have, they're not actual books, but there's one on auditory discrimination and there's one on first words. So everything we've talked about, I have little information booklets that are very inexpensive that can be purchased through the website.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Lois, thank you for pulling back the curtain on something so many parents sense but can't quite name. Understanding that listening is a learned skill and that the brain's ability to process sound is the bridge between hearing and truly understanding is genuinely game-changing. Your decades of wisdom have given parents not just answers but real hope and a path forward. For everyone listening, if you've noticed yourself nodding along or thinking of a specific child while we talk today, trust that instinct. You're already doing the most important part by paying attention. Be sure to check the show notes for ways to learn more about Lois's work and the resources she mentioned, and share this episode with a fellow parent who might need to hear this conversation. Thanks for tuning into A Parent's Guide to Child Development, where we decode milestones, demystify meltdowns, and occasionally question whether goldfish crackers count as a food group. Spoiler, they do. Make sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an expert tip, breakthrough strategy, or aha moment that can make a big difference in your child's development. It's cheaper than therapy and less messy than glitter slime. We'll be back soon with more expert advice, real talk, and zero judgment. Until then, keep calm and try not to step on any Legos.